Hello, and welcome to Shift Happens, where we talk to the people shaping the future of the automotive industry. I'm Sarah Blewett. I'm the head of research at Carwow.
I'm Sepi Arani, Sarah's co-host. I am Carwow's global managing director.
And today we're joined by Philip Nothard, insights director at Cox Automotive. Philip is one of the most well-known and trusted voices in automotive, and he's been in automotive for a whopping 37 years. So just to start, Philip, it'd be great to hear a bit about your background and why you've stuck around for so long.
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, Sarah, Sepi. I think, so 37 years here, it seems a long time. I've just ticked the 55 to 64-year-old box now, so I'm getting used to ticking the next box up. But no, I mean, essentially I started when I was 17 selling cars. But yeah, my career spans through dealership world for the majority of my career, through all positions within that retail dealership, from small independents to large supermarkets and PLC franchise groups, and then transitioned into the valuation sector. So I jumped on the other side of the fence a little bit, but couldn't get away from automotive. And then more recently, now 8 years at Cox Automotive, as you've introduced in terms of insight director. So quite comfortable in that valuation space and in that motor retail dealership sector as well.
So Phil, 37 years gives you an incredible, almost like zoomed out view of what's going on versus sort of people that have been in the industry or different roles for less time. I'm really curious. So in that 37 years, has there been a time that feels more volatile than right now, with more change going on?
Simple answer, no. I think at the minute, post-pandemic, this is the biggest change and shift the sector has ever seen and felt. Prior to that, everything was fairly static, fairly stable, where that comes to, consumer behaviours, the way they bought vehicles, the processes they bought vehicles, through to residual value management, etc. That now everything was fairly static. You could say we were quite a bit behind retail in other sectors, but no, I think you'd probably say that the last 5 years we've probably evolved quicker than in the last sort of 5 decades as an industry. So no, it's interesting and certainly exciting times that we find ourselves in today.
What's the sort of closest comparable time that you would say in terms of the amount of different things concurrently the industry's had to deal with?
I think in my career it's probably the pre-pandemic, if we put the pandemic to one side, because we're still obviously, on the impact of that, but probably the financial crash, that caused a lot of disruption and change and volatility to the sector, and that sort of 7-year recovery from that financial crash period and everything that happened there. So that's probably my lifetime, thinking about that sort of time that the sector was mostly disrupted and we sort of looked at change.
Super interesting. We're starting all of our conversations with our wonderful guests with a fixed question. Unpopular opinion. We're asking every guest this. What's an opinion you hold about either the market or directionally where we're going right now that most people either wouldn't hold or perhaps would push back on?
There's probably a few. Probably get challenged some of my opinions in certain areas. I think the one is probably the Chinese new entrants and what they will do to particularly the UK European sector. They are coming. They're coming very quickly. I think much of the sector have underestimated their power and appetite for growth. I think, if you look at the 2025 global production at 95 million and China producing 35 million of that global production in 1 year. And that's just the start. So, they are coming, they're coming quick, they are disrupting. In the UK alone now, you've got circa 75 manufacturers, whereas 2019, which is not that long ago, we had 40 manufacturers. So, that's how this market is shifting, and they are coming very quickly into the sector. I think some people underestimate that power.
We have been tracking new entrant consideration since 2022. And what we're seeing is really astronomical growth in consideration of these new entrants. And we're seeing it specifically in 35 to 54-year-olds, but really across all demographics, we're seeing an increase in consideration and across people who own all sorts of existing brands.
So Sarah, it's not just necessarily those that own, for example, Korean brands, considering Chinese brands. It's across the spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the biggest group, I would say, is people who own what you might call the volume legacy brands, the volume European brands we're seeing be most affected, but it's really the whole spectrum. And I think, Phil, you had done some research on this as well. What have you seen?
Yeah, not dissimilar. I mean, 52% of the under 34s have actually changed their manufacturer preference in the last 6 months. And, it's the German brands that are at the top of those that are shifting to looking at the new entrants as well. So, clearly, consumer behaviour towards attitude of the new entrants is shifted. There is a bit of geographical shift as well. So London and the South very much open to the new entrants. A little bit gets less as you move a little bit further north. And there does seem to be a variance between Glasgow and Edinburgh as well in terms of preference towards the new entrants. But I think, from both our research, I think clearly, the new entrants are disrupting. They are changing consumers' attitude towards what brand they have loyalty to. Obviously, the older they get, they are a little bit more brand loyal as you get into that 55 upwards territory. But I think clearly, the consumers are willing to adopt and change to some of these new entrants.
I think one thing we don't talk about enough is almost the snowball effect. Like, I think there's a magic number on UK roads. It sits between 10 to 15,000 cars of a particular model until you start to feel like you see them appearing everywhere. And I feel like that initial sort of cold start problem is the hardest problem that brands have. I think what we've seen sort of Motor JQ do is really explosively go in at the start. And then you start to see the cars on the road, and consumers ultimately, social proofing is a real thing. Seeing these cars on the road, seeing someone down your road have one, starts to really lift a lot of the challenges to considering one.
There's a really interesting stat that it took Hyundai 27 years to get to 2% market share in the UK. It took Tesla 10 years. It took BYD 2 years. And then it took JQ 9 months. That is explosive growth. It took them 9 months to get to 2% market share.
Yeah, I think it's a huge amount of work. And I think also just the shift to what's possible, I think considering lots of other channels, other routes to market. But I think, the fleet sector has also been huge for these brands.
Yeah, I think the strategies of the new entrants, they are thinking about that after sales, that downtime, that dwell time on product, the parts availability. Many of the new entrants have done a lot of research on the UK, European market to make sure that they have those relationships, they have that after sales, that service sector backup, because that's a key consideration, particularly when you start getting into that rental and that fleet market as well. So, as you say, that they are moving very quickly into that fleet sector. And you only need to look at the March numbers with the JQ7 being number one registered vehicle in March, beating the Ford Puma. So, it just shows that kind of volume that's going in. And back to your point again, Sepi, that, those vehicles are going to end up on the road. And that's in the consumer's eyes, on the driveways, on the road. And that's where the brand really starts to build, when those vehicles get seen on the roads.
So, Sarah, what's holding people back? Because there is, whilst we talk about, the explosive growth, it is from a standing start. So, of course, any growth feels huge. The reality, as we spoke about over the last few years, there is that model of consumers crossing the chasm. It's a new technology for a lot of people switching to EV, but at the same time, it's also a new brand group that they're joining. We still see a lot of consumers hesitant to go full EV, right? It's not just jumping into a new brand and EV. Is it broadly a 50-50 split into hybrids at the moment? Yeah,
so we actually just looked at how the current political climate is affecting people's decision making. So about 25% of people say they're now more likely to consider an EV, but interestingly, another 25% of people say that they're more likely to consider a hybrid. And I think it's really important to know that a huge amount of people are just still not ready to make the full EV switch, and they're much more comfortable switching to hybrid.
Which is really interesting because I think this is where the groups that have a product portfolio that spans not just EVs but hybrids, and they really push the hybrid messaging at the forefront, goes a long way because it makes the gap from what they currently have to an EV a bit more achievable with a hybrid in the middle. And some of the ranges are huge. I think a lot of people aren't quite ready to make that jump yet.
Absolutely. Phil, what have you seen?
One of the misconceptions in the sector is that the Chinese manufacturers are EV manufacturers, and that isn't the case. And, as I just referred to with the JQ7, that's a plug-in hybrid. The DMI products lineup within the BYD is hybrid. That's where they're winning a lot of their volume and registration volume. So that stepping stone towards that next level of a full EV. This is what they are winning market share on at the minute, and others, the more established manufacturers, that have that, as you say, that widespread of ICE versus sort of plug-in hybrid, mild hybrid, and EV are the ones that are winning some of that market share, because that's what the consumer wants. And I think at the time with the current conflict taking place and the energy costs rising and the fuel pump prices rising, then that research then starts to spike as consumers look at that alternative fuel type that gives them that more efficiency. And it's going to be interesting to watch to see how much of that search activity turns into true transactional activity in the future, because it's that change, that consumer behaviour as they start to think of alternative options for their next vehicle.
I think there's no doubt that consumers are willing to engage new brands, and I think we've also seen at speed when brands meet consumers where they want to be met in alternative channels, heavy on the content, heavy on engagement and brand building and the emotional side. And I think particularly when we look at other markets, if you visit the Middle East in slightly more peaceful times, the explosive growth of the brands there is a real story as well of just how people are ready to engage these brands. I think what's really interesting for me is the speed of change. So I think last year we saw the Denza, which is BYD's sub-brand, their premium sub-brand, alongside Yangwang and a few others, the Z9 GT be previewed in Milan. And at that point, it felt and looked like a good quality car. We didn't get a chance to experience it too much. It was on a track. Interestingly, we got back last week again from China and we saw an updated version of the Z9 GT. And that felt miles different in terms of the fit, the finish, the interior quality. I think what's really interesting for me is the sheer speed of product development, not even once they're in the market, but how quickly we're now seeing brands, Chinese, British, German, actually speed up that production process. And I think for consumers, that's a huge win-win. You're seeing things come to market much, much quicker. We're much more comfortable with over-the-air updates. I think consumers also are comfortable with things perhaps not being perfect, but the overall service quality around it being much, much better.
Just to add to that, I think just the speed, it's not, like you say, Sepi, it's not just the Chinese manufacturers. They are creating this competition. They are creating this innovation change, and alongside that quality of build and that quick cycle of change, and you think about some of that obsolete product now of BYD, the early product that now is not that old, but it looks old in the world of BYD. That what they've got coming, they're changing quickly, and the product lineup that's on the horizon from the existing manufacturers and the ones that are coming down the pipeline. It's very quick, and alongside comes tech, innovation, and quality.
I think it's really interesting because, without focusing too much on new entrants, we're almost seeing the existing brands, brands like Mercedes, come out with incredible new product. The entire new EQ range is, a huge advancement in terms of range, in terms of capability, in terms of technology that comes with it, without necessarily an inflated price point as well. I think although these brands aren't making as much of a splash in terms of SMMT penetration, the actual core products landing on our shores are fundamentally leaps and bounds ahead of where they've been over the last few years. And you definitely see that faster production cycle coming through.
So we touched a little bit on the impact of global current events on the market. What are you seeing, and what are your predictions?
I think we can't ignore that there is an impact. However that's going to be. The longer this Middle East conflict goes on, the longer the tailwind of the impact on the sector. We are seeing energy costs prices. We are seeing supply chain impacts already starting to happen. We are seeing production being impacted in some of that global marketplace. You can't lose a helium factory in Qatar that has a heavy supply into aluminium production and battery cooling and semiconductor chip manufacturing without having an impact. And I don't think we're getting quite yet to the COVID times where supply chain is severely halted, but you're already starting to see where China is buying up aluminium to ensure production continues. So we are having this impact on the sector already. If you look closer to home in terms of the UK, that base rate that we're expecting to fall this year, that's staying fairly stable. We've got pressures coming on inflation. But all in all, I think it has to resolve at some point. But we are starting to see some of that impact on a daily basis in the cost of motoring and cost of living.
I think even on a sort of a much more local level, if you're a transport company in Sheffield, if you're a dealer in Leicester, fuel costs ultimately are the backbone of the majority of our business. I think we're also going to see huge inflation in fuel costs over the next few weeks, and ultimately I think that's the near-term challenge, let alone the manufacturing costs for manufacturers in Europe and beyond.
And we've talked a little bit about this, talking about the global current events, but what would you say is driving pricing right now beyond that?
The manufacturing is when you get something that's happening in that global market, manufacturing and resource becomes more costly. To Sepi's point, that fuel pump prices become unattainable for some drivers or too costly for some drivers. So we are starting to see a little bit of that. But at the same time, production is becoming more efficient, putting to, where it's new entries, whether it's the existing manufacturers, their product efficiencies are improving, which is bringing the price of vehicles down. Technology is becoming the key driver rather than components on the vehicle itself. So, technology is an easier thing to do in terms of keeping up with the latest technology. Over-the-air updates is making things a little bit easier for the manufacturers to keep the consumers, with the latest technology. So costs are reducing and cars are becoming more efficient, less servicing, longer servicing times, etc. So yes, there are some cost increases, but there's also some cost reductions playing into the market as well alongside that.
Phil, I have a question. So we talk very much in terms of the here and now, in terms of the great success that entrant brands are having, in terms of hitting the ground running. But one view is that this is a point in time without considerations sort of down the road. So thinking back to your time focused much more on residual values, are we or are consumers likely to see a bit of a shock in 2 to 3 years' time when these sort of heavy volume of vehicles registered in 1 month, 2 month, 3 months starts to hit the market? Are we seeing perhaps residual values that are more favourable than they might be in the future? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think as we said right at the offset, the residual value market is at the most volatile point that it's been in a long time within the sector. You've got that mix of brands coming into the marketplace. You've got shorter cycles coming in, in terms of life cycle of vehicle product that, suddenly, and forgive those, but the small facelift on a Ford Fiesta that you used to get every 12, 18 months for a bit of a bumper refresh or a stereo system change or something minor that justified a bit of a price rise. Those are gone. These are big changes in the sector. And, you look at that residual value market and back to your point that, you look at not just the Chinese manufacturers. We saw through the Tesla period of that price adjustment, you had volume coming into the market at the same time as price adjustment. That has a direct impact on residual value in the sector, and that creates volatility. What we don't know yet is, the volume growth of the new entrants, the price competition that we've now got in the market, triggered by the pressure coming from the new entrants coming into the marketplace. What does that start to look like in 2, 3 years' time? Are the brands going to be strong enough as a used proposition to the consumer? We talked earlier about the appetite and perception of the new market, but will that continue into the used market for that 3-year-old vehicle to that 3-year-old used car buyer? Are the residuals going to hold up against that being? So I think we're in a bit of an unknown period at the minute. But I think it's certainly an area that is on a regular, daily, weekly conversation with a lot of the sectors to how do we manage this risk going forward.
What's your bet? How do you think this will pan out? Where do you think the risk is? Do you think the cars will become comparatively more expensive? Is this the cheapest we're seeing new entrants be?
There's a risk that the new entrants can become cheaper as volume and production increases and competition increases here in the UK. If you go back to China and you look at the Chinese government philosophy, competition is healthy.
But even in that domestic market, the government is stepping in to essentially stop a price war to protect. I find it fascinating because yes, healthy market competition, but to an extent. And if we look at what's happening there, you have government coming in with policy saying that this is unhealthy competition. You're chasing volume at the detriment of actual healthy contribution to the economy. Do you think we're likely to see? I can't see the UK government stepping in to do that in the UK, but do you think we're going to get to a point where competition, the only real winner is the consumer, and the brands almost are fighting over no margin that's left for them?
I mean, at the minute, yes. I mean, if you go back to everything we've just been talking about, new entrants, established brands, value, the consumer has never been in a better position for product choice, availability, cost of ownership than we've had before. When you've got 75 brands to choose from, all looking at market share, all fighting for that consumer, you've never been in a better position. But yeah, I think the reality is, if you go back over the decades, that used vehicles will always find a price point. They'll always find a price in the market. They'll always find a buyer. We've got 35 to 36 million vehicles on the UK roads. That will continue for some time. So they'll find a price point no matter what the volume. They'll find a channel into the market. Now, what you might start to see is renewal life cycles within the fleet sector. So you'll see it already within that fleet market. It's secondary leasing. It's even going to go into third leasing, maybe even fourth life cycle leasing, as those vehicles stay within that fleet environment for longer. So, those vehicles might not come out of that fleet ecosystem until it might be 6-7 years old into a used car marketplace.
Is that by design of the sort of funders and the fleet operators, or is that the manufacturers trying to sort of hedge their own brand residual values?
A bit of both. I think a lot of it is residual value protection, depreciation protection as well, because if you can keep that vehicle and you get utilisation for that vehicle for longer within your own ecosystem before you expose it to the open market and potential depreciation, then you protect your asset and you keep it on your balance sheet for longer. And the longer you keep it and the cheaper that product comes in terms of residual value, the less your exposure, the less your risk is when that vehicle enters the open market. But again, what you find yourself in today is that you've got such a competition and price point competition in the new car market that trying to manage a second and third lease that's attractive enough to the consumer is very hard, because there's such good incentives and availability of new vehicle product at the minute.
Yeah, you're so keen to push the new car volume that you sort of, the incentive, the carrot just isn't that big to take a 3-year-old car on a second life lease. Makes sense. Sarah, what's the one thing that you think existing brands, what's left on the table in terms of the best next move for them?
So what we're seeing in terms of what's slowing down the new entrants more than anything else is concerns among consumers about residual values and long-term reliability of these new brands. And so I think that's something that existing brands could really lean into. We have a lot of brands with a lot of heritage, with a lot of reputation for great reliability. Mm-hmm. And I think if there's one thing the existing brands can do, it's lean into that, lean into their heritage.
And I guess trust that already exists
Exactly.
for their brands in the market.
Yeah. If
Super
I would,
interesting.
one thing that's slowing down the new entrants is absolutely concerns, as we've been talking about residual values and long-term reliability. Phil, thank you. We really enjoyed hearing your insight and expertise.
It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for that, Bill.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to us wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thanks for joining us on Shift Happens.
See you next time.